Welcome back to Chapter 10. In this video, we'll be covering the second half of Learning Objective 10.1, and we'll be continuing to explore how people decide whom they want to like and who they want to get to know better. So we've already talked about similarity, proximity, propinquity, all of those things. Now we need to go to slightly more complex variables like reciprocal liking. Remember how we ended the last video on the idea of perceived similarity. We also need to think about how we perceive whether we like someone or not. A big predictor of that perception of liking is the degree to which we think someone else likes us. We find being liked really, really rewarding. So we like to be liked. And knowing someone else likes us and values us and all of those good touchy-feely things tends to make us feel more attracted to them than we would have otherwise. There are lots of cues, lots of clues that we pick up on to determine whether someone likes us. And the biggest determinant is the degree to which we believe it is true. Now, you may have been in situations where somebody really, really liked you and you didn't like them at all. They perceive that you do, though, and that can be super awkward, right? But, put that aside for the second. Whether the cues are things that people say or things that they do, the critical element is the degree to which you think the person that you're looking at or thinking about actually likes you. So as we explore reciprocal liking, what happens is when we get the perception that someone else likes us and we like them in return, that tends to create a mutual self-fulfilling prophecy, and not in a bad way. So you like this other person and you perceive that they kind of like you. They perceive that you kind of like them and they kind of like you. And it tends to feed off of itself. So when we get this sense of reciprocal liking, it tends to make us feel really, really good. It kind of tweaks those reward pathways in the brain and makes us like people even more. Now, shifting to more superficial cues, physical attractiveness matters, but it matters in ways that are dependent on where you're at in a relationship. We can spend a lot of time talking about the generalities of the impact of physical attractiveness, and there's loads of research on it, and it makes human beings seem super duper shallow in unpleasant ways. But remember, a good chunk of this chapter is the psychology of the first and second date, and the research is mostly done with young people. That matters. So I'll circle back around to that here in a little bit. So let's talk about what role physical attractiveness plays. It is an important factor predicting liking. In field experiments, so remember what a field experiment is. You have an experimental design, but you take it out into the real world, into the wild, and you look at actual behaviors. So rather than simply asking people what they say they will do, you're going to watch them actually do it. In these sort of field experiments, people show much greater interest based on physical attractiveness than they do to other variables that you could modify on the surface. So physical attractiveness tends to capture our immediate interest in other people. What many research studies show is that for both males and females, they tend to rate physical attractiveness pretty highly if you are asking them questions about sexual desire. So the critical element of the physical attractiveness story tends to be connected not so much to friendships, but to intimate relationships. Now, remember, a lot of this research has been done with college students who are much more likely to be dating and figuring out who they want to date, dating someone for a while, dating another person for a while. There's much more fluidity to the relationships. that we see in younger people. I'm not saying that physical attractiveness doesn't matter later, but it does tend to diminish in importance over time. And when you ask people in these studies, they may not have crystal clear awareness that physical attractiveness is driving what they're deciding in terms of who they want to approach and who they want to avoid. But when it's manipulated, when you manipulate the physical attractiveness of a person who is a date target, it matters. People tend to be more physically attracted, more sexually attracted to people who are physically attractive. So one of the questions that you could be asking is, what does it mean to be attractive? And that is highly dependent on culture, although there are some commonalities that we see cross-culturally in what tends to be perceived as physically attractive. Early in childhood, every culture has a set of communicated values related to physicality. It tends to be broken down on gender lines. So there are ideal images of what is physically attractive for a male. There are ideal images of physically attractive female, and so on. And these are fairly stereotypical kind of images that we have. And each culture's rules about what is and is not physically attractive are somewhat different in different time periods. So like when I was growing up in the 70s and early 80s, women were expected to be stick thin. I mean stick thin, small breasts, small hips, very thin. And then we shifted from that point in time to the 90s, where curvy women started to become super popular. For males, and most of this research really looks at heterosexual attraction, and we'll come back to that as we go forward too. For males in the 70s and 80s, you tended to have fairly lean, athletic bodies, but not a lot of muscle mass in the 70s. So some of the athletes, if you look at basketball players from that time period, they're not muscle bound and gigantic like they are now, where you have lots of really muscular basketball players. That didn't really start hitting hard until, a couple of decades later. There was also a tendency toward extremes of muscularity in males. And I'm telling you these things because, not so that I can take a little trip down memory lane, but cultures tend to experience changes in what they see as physically attractive. Like right now, we're in a moment in women's beauty culture where eyebrows are weird. I don't know if I'm alone in thinking that, but man, the eyebrows. When I was growing up, you plucked them till you almost had none. And now they are drawn on and they are angular, and it's kind of weird. And then there are all the magnetically attached eyelashes, and man, trends in eyeliner change all the time. So what's attractive and what isn't is highly dependent on cultural norms. And those norms are going to be transmitted from person to person. The media plays a role, but it's not the only role. And what is going to be seen as beautiful and physically attractive is going to shift from time period to time period. In the United States, the research tends to show that most of this research has been done with heterosexual people. So we're still playing some catch up as researchers, trying to find out some of the differences, the norms in queer culture for what is and is not attractive. In the research that we have available, heterosexual males tend to prefer female faces with big eyes, tiny nose, small chin, big cheekbones, high eyebrows, big pupils, large smile. Basically, that's a face that is very, very youthful and appears, not quite mature, to put it nicely. In the United States, heterosexual females have been found to prefer males with big eyes, and that's a universal. Large eyes tend to be preferred in virtually every culture. Prominent cheekbones, big chin, often square chin, and a big smile. Those tend to be preferred. The big smile, also a universal. So regardless of sexual orientation, regardless of culture, regardless of time, smiles have mattered, big eyes have mattered. Other features, culture plays a huge role in determining what's valued and what's not valued. Body size varies across cultures and within cultures over time. The amount of muscularity differs between cultures and across cultures or within cultures over time. Lots of differences there. So what do we know about cultural beauty standards? Across racial and ethnic groups, there are variations in what's expected, what's valued, what's seen as beautiful. So, if you have sort of race and ethnic group differences in physical appearance, those cultural contexts are going to kind of determine which aspects of those features are going to be highly valued. So if you have different shapes of eyes, shapes of lips, shapes of faces, shapes of nose, color of hair, texture of hair, all of those kinds of things, and color of skin, they're perceived differently in different cultural contexts. So if you go from one culture to the next, you're going to see different sort of expectations for defining physical attractiveness. There are some commonalities. We humans tend to prefer certain kinds of dimensions. We like symmetry. So if you construct like a computer generated face and you design it to be very attractive, one of the things, it will be unnaturally symmetrical. If you make it too symmetrical, too perfectly symmetrical, we will perceive it to be alien. But there's like this really golden space where we look at the person, and when their face is really pretty balanced, we like it. If it's too balanced, they look like a cartoon. So, I don't know if this reference will make any sense to you, but the Polar Express movie, it's, animated, with 3D animation. And one of the problems with the film, people were sometimes disturbed by the faces of the animated characters because they were just a little bit too perfect. They were too symmetrical. And we kind of find that extra symmetry a little disturbing. So we like symmetry, but not too much. And we don't like a lot of asymmetry. So like if people have eye sizes that are very different, or their mouth is different on one side of their face than the other. There was an example. Tom Hanks, the actor, was on a chat show. I think it was the Graham Norton show. And he demonstrated, he's very likable. He's not seen as off the charts physically attractive. He has kind of an everyman appearance. But he was like, they were talking about faces and symmetry. And he's like, I have a very asymmetrical face. And the other guests on the show were like, what? And he showed them. He was like, okay, camera, look at this side of my face. And he showed one side of his face in profile. And it was very attractive. He turned and showed the other side of the face. It didn't look like the same person. And the audience just went, oh, yikes. So we pay attention to a lot of these variables without even knowing that we're doing it. And sometimes we find those elements to be determinative in terms of how we do the math in our own heads. So as I mentioned, there are some universals for facial attractiveness. Things like big eyes, big smiles matter. Symmetry does tend to be preferred, but as I was saying, don't go too far so it looks like plastic. This is one of the reasons why when people have treatments through plastic surgeons or beauticians or whatever, if they make their faces far too similar, people notice it and they don't perceive it to be attractive. They find it worrisome and artificial. But we like a certain degree of symmetry, mostly to offset what a strong asymmetry might represent. We also, and this idea of average faces is kind of hard to wrap your head around, but they cover it in your textbook where they show you images of two separate women's faces, and then they show you a computer-generated combination of the two. That average face is reliably rated as more attractive. The reason why is because when you morph two different people's faces together, the averaged result tends to be more symmetrical than the two people separately. In the early days of Facebook, there used to be these games you could play where you took your face and then you matched it with another face. A lot of people got into the game of what would it look like if I had a baby with X celebrity, whatever the celebrity was. And you could tell Facebook to create what your babies would look like. It tended to produce images, fake images, of children who were far more attractive than either of their parents were. And part of what it was doing was just averaging the two faces, creating an artificial sense of symmetry. So leaving physical attractiveness behind for the moment, another variable that goes hand in hand with similarity is familiarity. It also connects way back to the last lecture with mere exposure as well. The more familiar we get with people, the more similar they feel to us, the more attractive they become to us because of mere exposure and so on. If we run into people a lot, if we see them a lot, we tend to feel very familiar with them due to propinquity and mere exposure. And that tends to breed a greater perception of similarity. You're seeing them in the same context. You're seeing them react in the same ways over and over. That feeds into familiarity. And then you start noticing similarities in yourself as well, because you're in the same context and you're seeing it repeatedly. And that also gives you more and more opportunities to express reciprocal liking. So if someone laughs at a joke and you laugh at a joke, you can tell each other, hey, I like that joke too. And yeah, I thought that was super funny. That's reciprocal liking. The more times that happens, it deepens the sense of familiarity and connection to the person. And that, that whole kind of dance, the more reciprocal liking you experience, the deeper your feelings for the person can be. Now, circling back to physical attractiveness for a moment, there's been a fair amount of research over the decades about how people view very attractive other people. We make certain assumptions. We make certain stereotypical judgments about very attractive people. I don't know how to put this. There are people who are off the charts attractive, and then there are regular attractive people. People vary in terms of the judgments of the masses, in terms of how attractive they're seen as being. If you think about celebrities, let's put them aside for the moment and just look at, if we asked people, what do you think about who this person is? And we show them an image of a person who has been ranked by other outside observers as very attractive. Like on a scale from 1 to 20, they're a 17, let's say. And you show them that picture and you ask people, so tell me what you think about this person. How many friends do you think they have? How happy do you think they are? How successful do you think they are? And so on. People tend to, when they're asked abstract questions like that and they're shown a picture of someone who's attractive, They tend to think they are friendlier, they're more outgoing, they have more friends, they're more successful, they're more likable, etc. So we tend to have a stereotype that being attractive is going to come packaged with a whole host of positive attributes that person must possess. The opposite is assumed for people who are seen as unattractive. So again, if you take a bunch of photos and you have people rate them, the people's photos who are rated as unattractive, if you ask then other participants to say, so tell me what this person is like, how many friends do they have, how outgoing are they, how successful are they, how happy are they in their lives, they will tend to downgrade them. They will tend to assume that they have fewer friends, they're less outgoing, they're less successful, they're less happy in their lives. What this is called is the what is beautiful is good stereotype. So we tend to assume that when people are physically attractive, they also have other desirable characteristics like being nice, being kind, being successful, having lots of friends. It's relatively narrow though, and it tends to only affect our decision making in very specific kinds of areas. Beautiful people tend to be presumed to be more sociable, more outgoing, more sexually successful, happier, more assertive with other people. Now, one thing we know, and part of what's happening here is that, from preschool, and this has been documented in preschool children, from preschool, kids that are highly attractive as rated by adults tend to be very socially active. They get more social interaction skills because adults pay a lot more attention to them, and so do other kids. So they get a lot of practice with social skills. They also tend to start reporting more satisfying connections with other people from preschool on. So a lot of what's happened is that people who are perceived by others around them as highly attractive, like they don't come out of the womb saying, hey, I'm beautiful. They have to get that communicated to them by other people. So if they start to move into early childhood, having a lot of feedback from adults around them or older children around them that they are pretty or they're cute or they are attractive, they start to behave in ways that match those expectations. So they get more social attention, they get more communications, they get more practice engaging. And that tends to give people more confidence. In contrast, the downside to this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy is that the kids who are perceived by grown-ups as not being particularly attractive, or they're not perceived by older kids as being particularly attractive, they get that message and they get a lot of rejection as a result. The other little kids, so their same age children, even in preschool, start to identify the less attractive kids as less social, less worth their time, less attractive for engaging in interactions, so less likely to be chosen to play with, and so on. So there's a brutal kind of reality to this self-fulfilling prophecy that we've all kind of bought into over time. And it shows up in our children's media all the time. So in Disney, you have the princesses and the princes. They're all very, very pretty. Until relatively recent, they're mostly white. That's shifted, thankfully. But the villains are still depicted as very unattractive by common cultural standards within the time frame when the film was produced. So in Cinderella, you have a pretty blue-eyed blonde girl, and then you have this stepmother and the stepsisters who all have dark hair and unattractive faces. Now, their physicality, their bodies haven't been manipulated, but in other Disney products, it's very common to have the big bad mean person be a very large, unattractive female. and or a very large, unattractive male. So that valuing of attractiveness is communicated from our earliest days, whether it's from our adults around us, older kids around us, or from the media. We get this strong social message that being pretty is a good thing, whether you're a boy or a girl, whether you're, gay or straight. Pretty is seen as valuable. Now we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at theories that are more at home in biology and neuroscience, and look at the way in which evolutionary psychology has explained how we choose people to have intimate relationships with. So this section of your chapter is about mate selection. So who are you choosing to have an intimate relationship with? From an evolutionary perspective, the whole idea is shaped around the ultimate evolutionary goal, which is reproduction and transmission of your genetic material to the next generation. Evolutionary psychology, if you remember from previous chapters, the goal is to explain complicated human social behaviors in terms of factors that have evolved over long periods of time, eons of time, based on the principles of natural selection. And the idea is that you want to mate with someone who has features, attributes that are likely to help your offspring and therefore your genetic complement to survive to the next generation and the next one after that. Now, the argument from evolutionary biology is that, and these are controversial ideas, to be sure. Evolutionary biology argues that males and females, and the assumption here is heterosexuality, so let's just, put that with a giant asterisk. Males and females are supposed to be attracted to very different kinds of characteristics in each other, for evolutionary reasons, primarily driven by the different roles they play in reproduction. So, for females, reproduction is described as expensive. Females of the species are born with all of the eggs they're going to have. They mature over time during a female's reproductive years. And every time those eggs are produced, every cycle, there's an opportunity for a pregnancy. Once that female hits a certain age, they are no longer fertile. So they have a finite area of time where they can be reproductive and have babies. And eventually that reproductive capacity is going to cease. So there's time pressure. There's also the reality of pregnancy. Pregnancy takes time. Human infants are born very needy and very weak and very fragile, and somebody has to take care of them all the time. The female of the human species evolved the capacity for breastfeeding and all of those things. So the evolutionary biology perspective says, you know what? For females, reproduction is really costly. It takes a lot of time, energy, effort. There's discomfort. There's pain of childbirth. There's also the risk of dying while it's happening. And you have to take care of these babies until they're mature enough to leave. So reproduction, as your authors put it, is serious business. So the theory goes, you're going to be picky. So the women are expected, based on evolutionary biology, to be super picky. In comparison, and what are they going to be picky looking for? Someone who's going to stay around, someone who can provide food and safety and security, someone who's going to protect you and be there. So that's the evolutionary biology argument, is it's about resources and protection, as well as staying around and not leaving. On the flip side, what are males looking for? Males, and this is the more less politically correct way of putting it, males want females who appear to be highly reproductive. So the old joke goes, and like a lot of successful jokes, there's a kernel of truth. Males, unless they have some sort of physical problem, disease, or disorder, they can be reproductively capable they're fertile from adolescence until they die, because males of the species produce sperm constantly. Unlike females, who you're born with a set number of eggs, you're not making new ones. Once they're gone, they're gone. Males just keep making more. So males can be fertile throughout the lifespan, whereas females can't. So what are males looking for? They're looking for women who appear to be highly likely to be reproductively successful. So they're looking for youth, they're looking for physical attractiveness, they're looking for reasonable sized breasts, wide hips, thin waist, and over and above a lot of other things, youth, because that means they're more likely to be fertile. Now, if you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, I know lots of people who get together and they don't care about having babies, or they can't have babies, and they knew it and they're still together. Yes, absolutely, I agree with you. This is the evolutionary biological perspective. Now, I'm not going to trash it or reward it. It is what it is. There are critics of it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But do understand that a lot of evolutionary biological research, since human lives are long and evolution goes over millennia of time, you can't study it experimentally. So you have to use other species that produce generation after generation really, really fast. So a fair amount of the research for evolutionary biology involves insects like fruit flies. They're not people. So it's difficult for evolutionary biologists to find evidence that directly ties to human choices. Humans are far more complicated in terms of the dynamics of their choices and their relationships than your average fruit fly. But you can't wipe out the fact that we have decades of survey research that tends to lend credence to the evolutionary biology argument. So let's look a little bit more deeply at this evolutionary argument about sex differences in mate preferences. The argument is, based on evolutionary biological theory, high reproductive costs for females. They're going to look for a male who can give them resources needed to successfully have a child and raise it. In modern times, what does that translate to? The evolutionary biological theory is, since their reproductive costs are high, they're going to be responsive to achievement, security, knowing a man that has goals, aspirations, and the capacity to achieve them, because those are things that represent resources that they and their kids will need. On the male side of the table, the idea is that males will look for women who appear to be capable of still having children. So they'll look for physical appearance that indicates and communicates youth. Age is a good predictor there. So health, youthful age, and reproductive fitness are what's being looked for according to this theory. Now, when we do large sample survey research, now, could you tell that I put those words in bold? Large sample survey research. So you're sending a survey out to thousands and thousands of people. On average, heterosexual females have been found to place a higher value on things like ambitiousness, industriousness, earning capacity than males did. They don't put it at the top of the list, but they rate it higher in importance than males did. And for males, they tend to put physical attractiveness higher on their list. Like if you were asking people to create a top 20 list of attributes in a potential partner, a romantic partner, someone you want to marry or be in a long-term relationship with, where men put physical attractiveness is higher in their top 20 list than where women put it. And for women, they value things like ambition, earning potential higher than where men put it. Interestingly, in the last 2 decades, males have been rating heterosexual males have been creeping closer and closer and closer to the ratings of females of ambition and earning potential. So males in American culture are starting to look at women who have good jobs as not being a bad thing and looking at it as more of a good thing. And similarly, females are moving more in the direction of where males are in terms of not physical attractiveness, but more of the warmth area, being caring, being capable of good parenting, and things like that. So we are seeing some movement there, but the kernel of truth is still present in these big surveys. When you look at those top 20 lists, though, the top 10 tend to be the same, regardless of the sex of people who are filling it out. And also, regardless of sexual orientation, people tend to want things like honesty, trustworthiness, being nice, being pleasant to be around. Those are things that people tend to routinely want. They even rate, the things that fit with evolutionary biology. They'll rate being funny higher than they will physical attractiveness, regardless of sex or sexual orientation. So kind of keep it in perspective. The evolutionary theory it makes a point, but you can't take it too far. So let's look at some alternative ways of thinking about these sex difference patterns. It has been found in a lot of primate species and also in a lot of other species that we used to think would follow these evolutionary biology patterns, that you would have males who were not particularly faithful, that they would have lots of sexual partners, and females would not. That females, even if you're talking chimpanzees, great apes, that they would be more monogamous. Early observational research tended to reflect that, but once the sexism bias was removed and they really started watching female chimpanzees, they are playing the field a lot. So what we're finding is that these rules about expected behavior in females because of the high inputs for child rearing and childbirth, the direct one-to-one connection between that and monogamy is just not holding. There are actually evolutionary advantages to multiple sexual partners because it ends up enhancing your gene pool by making it more diverse. By making your gene pool more diverse, you're less likely to have repeated genetic problems in the next generation. So you're spreading it out and you're actually improving the fitness of that next generation by having multiple partners and uncertain progeny. There's also, and this is more, a gender studies kind of sociological, psychological theory that challenges some of the assumptions of evolutionary approaches. There are clear, across cultures, differences in status, in power. Across the globe, females still tend to have less wealth and less power. I was listening to the radio yesterday, and every year they come out with this statistic. It's like, if you take all males and all females in the United States, what's the wage gap? And when I was early in my career, the wage gap was that females were making about 75 cents on every dollar that males were making. Now it's 80. We're up to 80%. Yay. So basically, women do tend to have less power and wealth. Another radio story that I heard this afternoon was that now that companies, post-pandemic, companies are rapidly moving the direction of demanding that people go back physically to the office. Here's the problem. Childcare is still wickedly expensive. And given the wage gap, if you have a heterosexual couple and they have children, who's earning more is still on average going to be the male. So they may decide as a couple, she will leave the workforce and stay home because childcare has gotten so expensive that her income will not offset childcare. So when you have a situation where you have systematic inequity, women are going to make decisions that are in some ways more tactical. Like, can this partner that I've chosen support us all, including the children? Given that I'm not going to be paid as much and I have less political power and less actual power on the ground in my world. So sociologists, gender studies people, psychologists tend to look at these status differences and normative expectations as driving these decision-making patterns. And it's an equally valid theory, at least equally valid. Some would argue more valid, but I'd rather not get into that debate at this point. Many people argue that these so-called evolutionarily derived gender differences, they can actually be changed. If the situation is modified, like if you compare cultures where you have a culture that has a very, very vanishingly small wage gap with cultures that have a large wage gap. In the large wage gap cultures, you see more traditional patterns of gender preferences in terms of mate selection. In the cultures that have little or no wage gap, those differences evaporate pretty quickly. And you see both males and females in a heterosexual context making their decisions using pretty much the same factors that they would as each gender. So males and females are using the same factors to make their choices. So gender differences are going to depend on many of these situational factors. Now, I do want to conclude by saying the evolutionary approach has been very controversial. For example, in the early days, and it's popping back up again, and I really, really hate it. There were some fringe elements within the evolutionary biology camp who argued that things like rape and sexual assault were explainable based on evolutionary biology. Basically, that males can't help it, that they are driven to reproduce no matter what. So consent doesn't matter. They are driven biologically to have sex as much as possible so that they can reproduce as much as possible. And when that argument, somebody actually tried to use that as a defense in a rape trial, that evolutionary theory argues that males have to do this, that they are required to. Now, the jury didn't buy it, thankfully, but it caused a big brouhaha in psychology. It caused issues in biology, and among evolutionary researchers, that this was just going too far. And essentially, the way I look at it, human beings have evolved in addition to, being biologically, the fact that there are biological differences based on sex. We have a giant brain, and that means, and we're highly social. So as, Finkel and Eastwood found, whatever these evolved differences are, the fact that we have evolved a very big brain, a highly social brain, means that situational factors often override whatever biological tendencies may have evolved thousands of years ago. We have choice. We have agency. So what the jury in that infamous case found was that, no, dude, you're still responsible. You do not get to use that as an excuse for your bad behavior. I think I'll just leave it there. We could spend a great deal of time, and if you take a gender studies course, there'll be more discussion of this in a deeper, more contextualized context than just, one section of one chapter in social psychology. So if you're interested in that stuff, I would encourage you to follow up. So that concludes my coverage of Learning Objective 10.1.